our medical thinking, even in the present day. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Alhamdulillah, it is a pleasure to be here. Dean Dalal, Georgetown faculty, individuals from the Pontifical Academy for Life. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm grateful to be following one of my mentors and teachers, Dan Salmezi. You will notice that as I've learned from him, our thinking is very much alike. So there'll be so many similarities that you'll think that we're giving the same talk, really. But that's just the fact that there is so much in common between our faith traditions and teacher-to-student relationship. So with that, I want to start by saying that I and the initiative in Islamic medicine that I lead works at this intersection of research between the Islamic tradition, biomedicine, and Muslim practices. We study how the Islamic faith of Muslim patients impacts their health behaviors and how it produces at times challenges within the healthcare system. We study how Islam informs the professional identities of Muslim physicians, and how, again, that might lead to certain challenges in the healthcare environment. Then we also study how religious scholars pontificate and proclamate over biomedicine, their texts, and how they do analysis of biomedicine as a body of knowledge. So we conduct empirical, textual, and theological research, and today in my talk I'm going to try to draw these strands together, thinking about, perhaps not as much clarity as Professor Salmezi did, thinking about end-of-life care and palliative care, because the title of this panel is Framing Palliative Care. So first I'm going to kind of map out the terrain, and then kind of give you a path through it, framing palliative care within the Islamic tradition. And the terrain, I think, is one that we all share, that today health is more of a commodity, or is thought of as a commodity that we purchase, right? We have industries that think about, I am wearing a Fitbit, right, that we can sell and produce health, although there might be data that says that that has no benefit at all to longevity, wellness, or health at all. That people think about are being able to decode, right, the genetic code and understand knowledge, right, about health. It's become an industry, and I think economics and how that plays a role in social structuring of healthcare is important to think about, even in this context. From that, you kind of understand that this is a larger symptom of what we think about as life, right? Life is good, and we have to max out your life, right? That's all it is. There might never be anything after that. We're not sure. And so this industry is on the back of this sort of larger global social culture about what life is and what it isn't. Death then therefore becomes an absolute evil, right? To avoid at any cost, and we have movements like transhumanism that try to do that, right? The victory of transhumanism is inevitable. We'll forestall death. And medicine is a social practice which is instantiated within this larger global culture. And so when we think about it as religious communities, about what medicine is for, we have to think about this backdrop, right, which we're speaking to. We're speaking to this backdrop particularly today, right, where almost 80% of individuals in the United States, at least, end up dying in the ICU, right? That's where their last moments are spent, hooked up to machines and monitors, right, which are soulless. And some might argue that that individual, too, on that bed has become soulless. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And where we want to go is to this vision, or the vision that was shared by Professor Salmezi of St. Francis of Assisi, right, where you're surrounded by loved ones who are tending to you and thinking about you and thinking about what the ontological reality of what is happening is. So my talk will parallel his. I'm going to present some theologies of life, death, and healthcare, talk about dignity and the good death from an Islamic perspective. I'm going to discuss the ethical, legal duties and moral comportment of the patient, or the dying person in this case, the healthcare provider, or in this case, the palliative care physician. And I'm going to highlight several applied Islamic bioethic stances, not trying to take away from others who might talk about this tomorrow, but related to pain control, terminal sedation, and withdrawing and withholding life support. So let's begin with some theologies of what life is, right? Life in the Islamic tradition, I would argue, would be of instrumental value, right? The Quran, and I'm going to kind of quote through some scripture here throughout my slide set to give you a sense and flavor of this. That the purpose of life in this world is, as the Quran says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, that we have not created man and jinn except for worship, and فَاعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ حَتَّى يَأْتِيَنَكَ الْيَقِينُ, right? That you should worship your Lord until it comes to you certainty, or in this case, that means death. So this point is that life is of instrumental value, and some would say it is from God, or min Allah ila Allah, right, to God. then what is this life what is it we're supposed to do? It's a mata', it's a place of cultivation, right? Of deeds, your record of merit for the afterlife. It is a temporary abode, right? It's in Allah, He creates life and death, or death and life. That creates, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates death and life to test you in of deeds. So that is what this place is. If that's the case, that life is of instrumental value, it's a journey from God to God, then we need to prepare ourselves with the best toolkit, right? And that's where health comes in, as we're told in a prophetic statement, that that the believer that is strong or has strength is better and more beloved to God than the one who is weak. But in both of them, in the twain, there is good. And hasten towards that which is beneficial to you. So this is how scholars analyze, well, this is what the Prophet said, that there is a benefit to being stronger. You can think about that term stronger in terms of spiritually. You can also think about that in terms of your bodily strength. Healthcare therefore then healthcare produces health, or generates health, which therefore increases one's capacity for good works. So that is also of instrumental value. They're using this and other statements from the Prophet. Medical practice becomes a fardu kifaya, and then healthcare seeking becomes a permissible, and in some schools of law, a recommended act, which only becomes obligatory when it's certainly life-saving. So this remains within the realm of permissibility, and as I said, I think Ayman is going to speak about that tomorrow, so I won't give too many details there. But it never or rarely becomes elevated to the status of obligatory for various theological reasons. That's the backdrop to then think about end-of-life care, right? This part of healthcare that, although it costs a lot, and we think about it a lot, is really temporarily, is a very small proportion of one's life. And then you think about palliative care, right? Which is in the larger scope. End-of-life care is a larger body of thinking and philosophy of health and healthcare. And then in the end, you have palliative medicine. So this is the money slide, actually, and I'll come back to this at the end, that I think when we want to frame palliative care within our Muslim societies, we have the prophetic example of how to do so. And you just take that will become your ars moriendi, so to speak, for the Muslim, right? And I'll detail that in a few slides, but to get there, I need to walk you through a few things. First, I want to talk about dignity. In end-of-life care or palliative care, dignity is a term that is often used, right? And it's used by every side in arguments, right? Some say that if you don't have someone hooked up to hooked up to ventilators and machines, you're not treating that individual with dignity. Others say that is the opposite, right? And that palliative care, one of its mantras is that you live, right, with dignity near death. Some talk about dignity as being some sort of right of exercising control over one's manner of death. Right? And that's an argument that's used. Therefore, it's called Death with Dignity Acts that talk about physician-assisted suicide. Others just say, throw this term away. It is just a term that's used, right, as a cover for religious groups to bring into the conversation to the mainstream, right? That it holds no other value. It is just that sort of term. So dignity is a term that you have to know about, and then therefore we must think about it when we're talking about Islam and Muslims, what that means for us. And so for me, one of the papers I cite that was very helpful for me thinking about how this term situates itself, or how it can be situated within the Muslim tradition, is from Dr. Salmai's Typology of Human Dignity. He did a lot of work to get there, but I'll tell you what I understand of it, and he can correct me in the Q&A. But there are three types of dignity that are used. This term is used in three different ways. One, and which he talked about in his talk, is intrinsic dignity, right? Which is the worth of value that human beings have simply because of the thing that they are, the kind of natural thing that they are, the natural kind. It's attributed to all human beings equally, in equal measure, and is not diminished by illness, right? That's intrinsic dignity. Attributed dignity is dignity that's conferred to other individuals, right? So a dignitary comes in, we say someone, right? We're conferring dignity on that individual on the basis of their position, their skills, their virtue, their power. It's a curated value, right? And then you have inflorescent dignity, which is the expression in behaviors, actions, or states of being that demonstrates the highest ideals of one's nature. It's related in that sense to intrinsic dignity, right? That it comes out. This is the most flourishing that one can be and is expressed. And you also see that person was very dignified in his comportment when facing death. We use that in our vernacular. So there's another term, another typology of what dignity represents. There are some homeomorphic equivalents, or you can call them conceptual analogs, whichever one you want, within the Muslim tradition for each one of these, right? So dignity is talked about in terms of two terms that are in my reading, karama and hurma, right? Dignity as karama is this notion of honor and generosity, right? It's attributed in the sense and they're attributed in the heavens, but in this world it becomes sort of intrinsic. That's dignity conferred by God to human beings is a reflection of God's lutf, His grace, and all human beings share equally in this favor of being created by God. And so the verses even talk about by His hand, right? It's intrinsic, as I said, it's because of the kind of thing that they are, the kind of creature God created. The other term that's used is about hurma, and also maps on to human dignity in a sense. That Arabic root is from sacredness or prohibition or inviolability, right? And you'll see this in the scriptural sources that I quote in the next few slides, that it relates to this notion of inviolability of property, of honor, of body, right? But also of functionality. And therefore it's used to talk about the human body being sacred. So here are the scriptural sources backing up that both of these terms have a mapping onto into dignity. So here's the scriptural sources for intrinsic dignity. Right? That this, and I'll translate, sorry, I didn't put the translations there. That for every Muslim, upon a Muslim, right, they're haram, right? Meaning what? His blood, his possessions, and his honor. Right? This inviolability belongs to all of this group, this community, all members equivalently, and it leads to a negative right? That you don't kill, take their possessions, and dishonor them. That the breaking of the bone of the dead individual is like breaking the bone of the one who is living. Again, the inviolability of this notion of intrinsic dignity, it extends to the dead state. It's not just the body when it's ensouled, but rather even after that there is some sort of dignity of that body itself as the kind of thing that it is. Right? There's a negative right again of not disrupting that. Or this verse, this hadith here, which Professor Musa mentioned a bit of, the end here says, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ خَلَقَ آدَمَ عَلَى صُورَتِهِ. Right? So the beginning starts when you face each other in war, right? Don't strike the face of the other combatant. For فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ خَلَقَ آدَمَ عَلَى صُورَتِهِ. That God has created Adam upon his form. And that what that form means is debated, as you mentioned, right? But the human form is special. And if you think about this, the way the grammar works in this scriptural text, it is related to God again. فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ خَلَقَ عَلَى آدَمَ, right? That He created Adam. So it's again conferred by God upon this form, this shape, this visage potentially of Adam, or the son, or the sons or the children of Adam. Okay, so that's intrinsic, and I mapped that onto largely hurma. Then you have attributed dignity here. That if a person of a tribe comes to you who is honored, then also honor that individual, and that leads to a positive right. The first slide set was about negative rights. Don't violate, don't hit, don't do this. Now it's what do you do for that person? Right? You now also honor the individual coming to you who's known as an honored individual in that community. And this verse here, I won't recite the whole verse for you, but it says near the end here, right, that that the one who is most honored to God, right, is the one who is most conscious of God. Meaning that the righteous deeds of individuals elevate oneself in the sight of God, that there are gradations of merit. So while we talked about the idea that intrinsic dignity at one level is equal and shared by individuals, right? Because the verse that is attributed to, that is derived from, talks about, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that I created the children of Adam, right? And that we gave him honor upon the children of Adam. So everybody is a child of Adam who's a human being, therefore everybody's equidistant from God, has the same dignity. But here, there's a notion of attributed dignity. Your deeds elevate you. Right? Your righteous deeds elevate you, your merit making elevates you in a certain sense. So there's both this equivalence, but also a gradation that occurs within the mapping of dignity within the tradition. How does this relate to theological ethics kind of at the end of life? Well, every intervention, every medical intervention can impinge upon either human dignity in the sense of karama, right? Or the inviolability of the human being in terms of hurma. Every intervention. Even just the fact of being in the hospital, right? There are indignities of being in the hospital. And also that preserving the mere physiological life is not a worthy goal in and of itself. So that also comes from scriptural texts. Again, I believe others will speak about this tomorrow, so I don't want to give too much away about that. But I would just say here, for the purposes to build up this argument I'm getting to why the prophet's example is the one that we should think about when framing palliative care, the quality of life is tied to the ability to effect good works. Just take that as, right, that this notion of what his life is for instrumentally relates to merit making in that sense. So how does this relate to us thinking about end-of-life care in terms of the implications of karama and hurma? Well, karama comes from this notion of equidistance from God. So you must focus on God's man relationship in illness, the dependency, right? You should think about providing spiritual support. And you should seek to preserve consciousness. And I say that because consciousness is a condition for worship and spiritual practices. If life is of instrumental value to make your station in the afterlife better, then consciousness is a prerequisite to doing that sort of activity. Hurma, in terms of inviolability, relates to a cautious approach to invasive clinical interventions because you want to preserve that integrity of the body, both while it is inhabited by the soul, also when it is not, right? So therefore, when it is not, post-mortem examinations are restricted except for certain legal causes. Okay, so we talked about intrinsic, talked about attributed dignity, how they implicate, what the implications are in end-of-life care. Let me return to the example that I said was the money slide before I go into the next parts of my talk, much less, I guess, much less descriptive in that modality. So let me spend a moment talking about and sharing this story. So I can share personal stories, but this is the one that's very important about the final days of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and how that relates to our thinking about fluorescent dignity, how to have a good death through his life. So there are several instances, and one of them talks about that he takes his servant with him to the Jannat al-Baqi, to the cemetery of where his companions are buried. And he walks there and he goes there and he's overheard by his servant saying certain things. And one of the things he says, Al-Rafiq al-A'la, Al-Rafiq al-A'la, the higher companion, or the highest companion. And then he comes back to his servant who is standing at a distance and he says to him, what would you do? This is paraphrasing. If I told you about an individual who was asked about everlasting life or being with, highest companion, and he says, what would you think about that individual? What choice would they make? And there are other narrations that talk about different ways he said this. He's actually referring to himself. He was offered a choice of having everlasting life in this world or being with the highest companion, meaning being with God. And the person overhearing him saying, Al-Rafiq al-A'la, he was choosing to be with God, right? And so this carries on. He becomes ill. Many people talk about types of illnesses he had. He had a headache, he had fevers. And he ends up staying in the house of one of his beloved wives. And he sees what ends up happening is that people are thinking about, can we cure him? Can we give him medicine? At one point, they try to put something in his mouth, right? Some medicine. He turns away. And then they do it, they give him the medicine. And when he regains consciousness, or when he regains his sort of power, he sort of makes them all take that medicine. And he asks his wife, Aisha, whose house he was in, what were you doing? He's like, we thought you were turning away just like any patient wants to turn away from medicine. That's what they were assuming. But rather he was rejecting this notion of futile, and some would say futile, some would say just medicine in itself, because he had already chosen to be with God, right? That medicine, he made everybody else taste that. Near the final moments in the narration, again in her house, a companion comes in who actually ends up being the brother of Aisha, whose house he's in, and he has a siwak, he has a toothstick in his mouth. And the Prophet now is really incapacitated, so he's looking at it, right? And his wife thinks that he wants it because he used to have a practice of cleaning his teeth. So she takes the toothstick, moistens it with her mouth, right, crunches on it, and puts it in his mouth. And in the narration we're told this is the last thing, right? She talks about how her saliva and his saliva mixed at the end of life, at his last moments, right? And several days before this, I didn't put on the slide, he had gone out after getting bathed in water to the mosque to lead prayer, and he asks people that if you have anything to take of me now. If you have anything to take of me, if I owe you anything, take of me now, right? And no one says anything, and a companion gets up at the end to say, I have something. And his closest companions get up to try to push the man down or got very upset with the man, and he says, no, right? No, let him, this is a time for him to ask. And he says, you were on a camel, you were trying to strike the camel, and this whip that you had hit me. So he turns around and takes off his back and says, now you can hit me with this. Right? The idea being that justice needs to be served in this world. Justice needs to be served in this world. If I owe someone something here, I can't take care of it in the afterlife. I must do it here. So the point of all this is that if you frame palliative care as such, this is the exemplar for us, right? And the goal of care, if you're thinking about the health system, is to maximize merit making, to preserve the cognitive and physical functioning of an individual to that state, that they can discharge these responsibilities if they want, to attend to the God-man relationship, provide spiritual support, counseling as needed, right? To rectify yourself with God. And that is why I mentioned in my comments here that the model of chaplaincy is very different in the Muslim world. They're called Murshid Dini. They're actually trying to make righteous guidance, right? For the individual. Make yourself right with God before you meet your end, which is different than the way you think about it in the United States, right? The ethical guidelines based on Hurma and Karama here, balance harm and benefit of the proposed interventions. And then we really need cultural interventions. This is what in every part of our life, we're told, follow the Prophet, how he prayed, right? What he did. But we've forgotten how he approached that end, right? This is our contemporary Ars Moriendi. And how do we do that in our Muslim sort of cultural society? And these are some interventions that occur in different places. So there are death cafes in the United States, right? You get together over coffee to talk about death. We share a lot of coffee here, ahwa. Well, why don't we talk about hadim al-ladhat, the thing that we're told, akthar dhikriha hadim al-ladhat, that you should make a lot of mention of the thing that will, the destroyer of pleasures. We should do that. Let's have dinner over it. Right? People actually sit together, make elegant dinners, they have conversations about death so that their family knows what their preferences are. We're talking about families making decisions for us. How come we haven't told our parents, children, fathers, sons about what our preferences are, how we want to approach death, what they should do, who they should talk to, right? I myself, the Initial Islam Medicine is here, this is the other thing, right? We have workshops in mosques where we talk about the ethical rulings around brain death and end-of-life care, what you think about, again, to give people some touch points to think about before they're in that state. And we know we have in masjid's funeral management workshops, right? How do you bury, what's the wash, how do you wash, what those things are, but they often neglect the ethical ideas. So this is the sorts of cultural interventions we need, and we actually test them to see if they work, right? There is a methodology, scientific methodology, to test whether these interventions improve knowledge, understanding, and their experience of end-of-life care. So now I'm going to transition. I want to foreshadow some things I believe tomorrow some individuals will talk about. I spend a lot of time right now in terms of Islamic bioethics, where I think about it as different sort of genres coming together. The inputs from the Islamic side would be Islamic law, theology, and ethics. I talked about theology for a moment. Let me touch upon ethics before I end with Islamic law. So you'll find this interesting, Professor Salmezi. I don't know if I shared this with you before, but there is a tradition, one of the highest traditions, Hadith Qudsi, about the God. Is sort of the Prophet's talking about God and what God's saying near the end of time, and in this case, in the Day of Judgment, talking to one of his creation. And he says that, I was ill, but you did not visit me. And he says, well, you're the Lord of the worlds. How could I visit you? Well, if you went to so-and-so who was sick, you would have found me with him, right? That this notion funds a duty to visit the sick. And now this is my foreshadowing for Professor Musa. I didn't plan all this. I'm also Akbari in a certain sense, right? We think about the interaction between the patient and the provider as actually just interaction between the names of God. That would be an Ibn Arabi sort of notion, right? That we're all just reflections of the attributes of God between Al-Mumit, right? The one who takes away life, and Al-Hayy, the one who gives life. In that interaction between those two names of God is all of healthcare. And if you think about that, that's all that's happening. You're seeing God, you're acting as an attribute of God, or if you want to be not an Akbari, you can say it was Shafi, right? I'm acting out the one who cures as a physician. That is the theological notion that leads to certain types of adab, practices that we need to cultivate in being a dying person, or being the one who's tending to a dying person. This adab with God, right? That's the highest and most important thing. How do you relate to God? What is the comportment you have towards Him? So I'm not going to go through all these texts, recite all the texts here. I just have them in case you want to know where they came from. But the notion is, right, that the affliction and relief from affliction, right? Anzala da'wa diwan is from God. That's what's happening in the healthcare encounter. So the dying person should be thinking about that my affliction is from God, and my cure will be from God, and that is who I need to resolve myself or attach myself to. That you need to have a good opinion of God, right? أَنَا عِنْدِي عَظَنِّي عَبْدِي بِي, that I am in the opinion that my servant has of me. And la yu'minu ahadukum, that none of you believe until you have a good opinion of God. The point being that you should have that good opinion. That's ultimately what you're desirous of. Having a good comportment in front of God. The healthcare provider is just a means for it. But there are limits. And this I will sort of recite the Arabic because I think it's important. The companions who got sick, they even asked him, well, can I ask for death? This is too much for me. This life of trial or tribulation is too much for me. Different narrations come about whether it's a stomach ailment, other people said, and he gives him this prayer. Allahumma ahyini ma kanat hayati khayran li, wa tawaffani idha kanat wafata khayran li. That you can't ask for death, but if it comes to you at this point, then you should say, oh God, bring to me, give to me life, or keep me alive, so long as there is goodness in it for me. And bring to me death, if there is goodness in it. Death is not the ultimate evil. There can be goodness in death. And that is the most that you can ask. You can't ask for death, but you make this prayer. Right? Again, life of instrumental value. Important here, both life and death are of the same instrumental value in the wording of this prayer. Each of them, right, can bring about good. Limits in terms of dying person, as I mentioned, was you can't ask for death, but also that you can't partake of impure substances. So we'll leave that for a moment. I know I'm running out of time. The provider, again, the most important relationship is that comportment towards God. So you have to recognize that you're but an instrument. Again, that God is the one who heals, He's the one who sends out illness and cure. You have to strive to deliver the best care, right? We know this hadith, إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَتَبَ الْإِحْسَانَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. Interesting, that hadith, that saying is the beginning of a hadith about destruction, about killing or sacrificing an animal. That even in this notion of destruction, you should have ihsan, excellence in what you're doing. And that you give comfort and hope. Again, I wanted to draw parallels to what Professor Samezi was talking about. That, when one of you visits the ill, then reassure him regarding his lifespan, right? Indeed, that won't change anything, but it will bring comfort to his soul. We should be thinking about hope, not that you will get cured, but you give hope and glad tidings to the individual. The limits of this, right, is that all of us physicians, to think about the end of this hadith, that we are all liable and responsible for what we do. If we don't know, if we act outside of our expertise, we'll be called into account on the day of judgment. And then this, do not take life, right? I started with this hadith, that this hurma of life, that you can't take life. This is made inviolable by God. So finally, right, I think the counsel for providers should be that we should build up the influential dignity at the end of life through spiritual support, counsel to set right the affairs of this world. People should have a good opinion of God. Now, whether I ask this question for those providers here, whether that is the responsibility of physicians or of an institutional religious leader in the hospital, that is for you to figure out, but I think that must be done. We should respect and acknowledge human dignity. Illness does not lessen the intrinsic dignity. In this case, the one I'm talking about is the attributed dignity, the attributed by God dignity in Islam. Ending a life threatens this value, and we should limit indignities in care. Finally, right, as scholars gaze upon biomedicine, I want to just share a few things. So we know what ends up happening is that oftentimes a legal scholar is asked by a physician, can I do something? What's Islamic hukum on this or that? They think about the Quran and Sunnah and the maqasid and the qawaid, and they come up with some legal ruling. Now, this oftentimes I want to share with you that physicians are also disquieted by this juncture in healthcare, this area, right? So I did a national survey of Muslim physicians in the United States. We found that they found withdrawing and withholding of life support to be challenging. 79% found it more ethically problematic to withdraw than to withhold life-sustaining treatment, right? And this is an experience, and I agree with Dan that is much more troubling. I think that also relates to how we think about it in an Islamic legal sense. If that's what people experience, there is some input for that, how we think about it as a legal category. Interestingly, 18% disagreed that compliance with the competent patient's request to withdraw life support was mandatory. This is the dominant teaching in the United States. Individuals didn't feel this way. And 46% did not view brain death as equal to death. There is disquietude amongst the Muslim physician population in the United States. I'm sure in other places as well, this would hold true. In terms of withdrawing and withholding life support, everyone's in this room, she and I and others, we did this review of what the Fiqh Council say about this, and I want to give you the money slide there. That two broad guidelines are seen when you look at all the fatwa around withdrawing and withholding life support. And these guidelines are that you can withdraw or withhold when the clinical state of a patient is such that medical care is futile. Again, paralleling what Dan said, harms, outweigh the benefits. And also when individuals have brain dead physiology, that the obligation to initiate or continue life support ceases to exist. Some would argue this is not death, some would say it is legal death, some would say it's a dying state, but it doesn't matter. Both camps allow for the withdrawal of life support. Fine, now I'm really ending. So about pain control, because it was mentioned again today, pain, I would believe, and I find it really problematic when we think about pain as equating to suffering. There is some benefit theologically to suffering or pain in this world. The Prophet talks about expiation for sins and many other things. So I don't think pain equates with suffering, but it is a harm in as a legal category, and it's subjective. Loss of conscious and control is to be avoided when you do give pain control. This is because of the notion of preservation of intellect, and again, because you need to have intellect and consciousness to perform religious duties. And it must be proportionate and titrated to patients' needs, right? As an empirical person, we have to think about what is most appropriate for a society or for an individual. Some people can tolerate, opiates work for them, some people it doesn't. And we're talking about marijuana now for various things, right? So you have to think about what it is and what the data behind that is. As far as terminal sedation, it follows from the above that you can't kill, right? So it's not permitted. As the end goal, ending existential crises and all these things is not one that is considered legitimate from an Islamic ethical legal perspective. So this is where we're at in the hospital. We want to get away from that. We want to have a more community-based palliative care. I agree with that notion. I don't think we want euthanasia coasters, which is what some people say we can do, that we can actually create. This is a thesis by an individual, I forget in which country in Europe, where he calculated what height a roller coaster needed to be. And I know these Arabs are about building high buildings, but this was like, if you go on this roller coaster, by the time you end, you'll have brain dead physiology. So you die, right, on a roller coaster. I don't think we want to do that, and I hope I haven't confused you too much. With that, I'll end.
A question, and it's related